Hey, Armand here to discuss Saturn in Aries 2025 to 2027. What we're going to do is a brief overview for the collective, then a little instruction on how to listen to the forecast for your sign, and then we'll do each sign separately. All right, so that's our plan as we go through this video. So Saturn in Aries. Aries is Saturn's, traditionally, Aries is Saturn's least favorite sign. Saturn doesn't like being in Aries very much. After all, the energy of Aries, that impulsive will, it's will, right? It's individual will. Here I am. The crocus is popping up in the springtime. Here we are, kind of energy is not really great with Saturn, which is much more about structure and limitation and exactly how things should be. You can kind of see how these energies could work together, right? As we're sort of on the seesaw between individual will, I'm going to, and then the more limiting and potentially constructive side where Saturn says, well, let's not do too much. Let's not go too far with things. Potentially could be quite constructive. Is it going to be? I don't know. So the last two times that Saturn was in Aries, the most recently was 1996 through 1999, or it was 97 through, it was the late 90s. And that was kind of like the roaring 90s, right? I mean, I was in my 30s, so I probably like it a little bit better than, maybe if I was being a little bit more objective, but it was a pretty good time all in all. Certainly economically, it was good. There was generally a sense that we had kind of like, stepped into a new world order post Cold War, and we were now living that out. It didn't last too long. But the late 90s were a relatively good period. And then the previous time was in the late 60s, 1967 to 1969. That was 69. If you're a New Yorker, that was a great year. Then, you had the Jets won the Super Bowl and the Mets won the World Series. Although the Mets won the World Series, Saturn had already gone into Taurus. But I digress. The late 60s, certainly a mixed bag, right? 1968 is often seen as like a very pivotal year. 67, Summer of Love, 68, not so much. So we got a mixed bag with that. What I'm pointing out here, though, is that Saturn in Aries isn't necessarily this great big downer or anything like that. It's not going to provide good times, but it's not necessarily going to stop good times if for some if for some reason we get good times, Saturn and Aries won't stand in the way. What we're likely to see mostly is a bit of a check on individual power, right? But not so much people in authority. People in authority, Saturn may squelch more individual attempts at autonomy and will. That would make a lot of sense. But I think, on the other hand, that we'll also get a kind of focus on some things. Now, Saturn in Aries is doing two things, okay, with regards to our situation, let's call it. The first is that he is going to be dealing with the changes that happened during the Uranus in Aries era. That was 2011 to 2018-19. This was the era of, as I said, going rogue is in vogue, right? This is the era of people, Uranus and Aries, people doing their own thing, and groups that were outside groups coming to the fore. This was the era that began with, on the left, the Occupy movement, and on the right, the Tea Party, and ended, well, essentially, the 2016 election would be one where we had a lot of outsider energy in the U.S. I apologize for being US centric, but you can see around the world where we had similar things. We also had the rise of real political strong men, and they're all kind of men in this context, through the Uranus in Aries era, which also happened the previous time Uranus was in Aries, which was in the 1930s. All right, so that was that era, right? And it was a time when people were really sort of going off the charts, right? We had a lot of people who were, bucking the trend, who were subverting. Oh, there was the whole WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and so on. The very Uranus and Aries character. Okay, so that's what was happening then. And the way Saturn and the outer planets work is that Uranus, in this case, or the Uranus-Pluto square, the years 2013 to 2017, to be a little outside on things, the Uranus-Pluto square rips up the tracks, and then Saturn comes along and paves over and says, okay, well, this is what you did back when you were feeling for it. Now let's see what we're going to turn into law. Let's see what we're going to concretize. Let's see what's going to stay. You've experimented, Uranus, right? You've experimented. Now let's see what happens. What are we going to keep, right? How did the experiment turn out? What are we keeping and what are we getting rid of? That's what Saturn is doing as regards the Uranus-Pluto square and Uranus's time in Aries. How far to the outside did we really want to go? And what are the consequences of going that far? Right? So we got to see, do we like this idea of having a lot of autonomous strong men running the world, or are we thinking maybe we've gone too far in that direction? And I'm not, and don't think I'm being US centric here because I'm not. I mean, you could point to Hungary and Poland and the Philippines and Brazil and lots of South America. India. It's not something that is limited to one place. And of course, that is an assessment of the way in Russia, by the way. That's an assessment of the way things are running. It's not. I mean, I don't like it, but it's an assessment of the way things are running that I think is fairly well accepted. The idea democracy might just be too hard, that type of thing. Well, that was very much the Uranus-Pluto square. But how do we feel about that now? Saturn is going to say, well, okay, but there's a price for that, and this is what the price is. That's the first thing collectively that Saturn will be doing over the course of the next few years. The second thing, though, is that as Saturn comes and paves over the road, he's going to also meet with Neptune, who is in the sign. We got an interesting little dynamic here, right? Because this time Neptune is in the sign already, but Saturn is coming in and is going to go out while Neptune is really still at the very beginning of the sign. That's a kind of an interesting dynamic. Here we have Saturn coming and paving over the road, and then Neptune says, yes, but you built it next to a swamp, and the water is seeping in, and what you put in place may not stick. And remember, Saturn isn't very strong in Aries, so very possibly it won't stick. Just to think about that. So what is the price we're paying for the 2011 to 2018 era? Saturn is saying it. What are we distilling out of that? What are we keeping? What are we getting rid of? And then Neptune comes by and says, well, maybe not. So that's what is put in place may not stick. Now, importantly, and there'll be a separate video on this in early 2026, which you should subscribe so that you get the notice there. Saturn and Neptune are going to meet at the very beginning of Aries. Now, Saturn and Neptune meet every so often. And Saturn, the planet of structure and our institutions, and Neptune, collective fascination, when they get together, they sort of set the tone for what we think the world is about in a sort of geopolitical sense. I suppose well, no, since Neptune's been discovered, it's always been a geopolitical sense. Um, Going back to the last Saturn-Neptune meeting in the late 80s, and then there's a lot of stuff happening in Capricorn through the early 90s. This was the end of the Cold War. It was the end of that polarity, the sort of there's the first world, second world, and third world. It was, and then it sort of became this kind of, we're all going, globalization was the key word there, right? Everything is becoming global. It was the formation of the European Union. It was the end of the Iron Curtain. That whole dynamic really just faded over the course of about 4 or 5 years. Uranus was involved as well. And we sort of got a new world order there. That was a term that was around, that was popular back at the Saturn-Neptune conjunction back there in 1988. Um, that was that was the new world. Now, if we go back to the early 50s when Saturn and Neptune met in the sign of Libra, that was when we set up the dichotomy, the Cold War, the this world, that world type of thing. We're going to have there's the communist world, there's the free world, and then there's the third world. Didn't get a lot, third world didn't get a lot of attention, but you get the idea. That was the dominant myth of, politics and society for just about 40 years, about 36 years. And then they met again in Capricorn. That myth fell apart and it became the myth of globalization and, sort of a world without borders type of thing. And that lasted not too long, but it really, really took a hit as Pluto went through Capricorn from 2008 onwards. Anyway, Saturn, Neptune set the tone for what we think the world is about. And in Aries, we're going to have to see, because that's a sign of competition, it's a sign of war, it's a sign of individual will. And well, we'll revisit that, but that is a big meeting that is happening in early 2026, and that's one of the things Saturn is doing. All right, now let's talk about each sign. If you watched, and you should have, if you watched the video on Neptune going through Aries, you'll say, well, here we have here we have a very different planet, but it's going through the same sign. So is it going to affect each of us, if you're an Aries, if you're a Taurus, and so is it going to affect us in the same way, a different way? How are these contrasting energies going to work? Well, Saturn will give you something to think about and something to deal with in your life. Neptune it's really, really difficult to say. As I made clear in the Neptune video, Neptune is not really very clear on how it's going to manifest, and it's likely not going to manifest in a direct way for many of us anyway. But Saturn does manifest in a direct way, and Neptune, otherworldly possibilities, fascinations, and obsessions. Saturn, the concrete reality. These things would seem to be very different. First you get Saturn. Most of us get Saturn first, and then comes Neptune. If you're very early Aries, it goes the other way. But most of us get Saturn first. And as I said, Saturn gives you something to deal with, and then Neptune comes along and maybe fogs it out a little bit. One difference, though, that is really, really, you should pay attention to this difference. One difference is that for Neptune, I suggested that you use your sun sign, right? You should use your sun sign. For Saturn, because Saturn by house position is pretty reliable in terms of what you have to deal with, I would suggest you use the ascendant. So it'll be the forecast for the ascendant. It will work for the sun sign. It'll work for the sun sign, but in a slightly less overt way, a little bit more of what you're thinking about, what you're feeling for, a little bit less of, what's going to be. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. You can use either one, but the ascendant sign, you can look up your ascendant online. There's lots of ways to get your ascendant, or you call me. We'll for a nominal charge, we'll have an astrological consultation, and we'll answer the questions about your ascendant and so on. But let's talk about with respect to the sign. We'll start with Aries. Aries, for you, it doesn't really matter if it's a sun sign or if it is the ascendant sign. Either way, if it's Aries, you've got pretty much the same experience here. It's that sense of will, that sense of here I come, I want to be included, I want to do this, I'm participating. It's not, it, sometime during the next 3 years, Saturn will kind of damp that down a little bit and consolidate. Consolidate. You can't choose everything, Aries. That's the thing. That's what Saturn is saying. You can't choose everything. You can succeed, but you can't choose everything. Just saying, that seems to be the thing. If you have an Aries ascendant, you should know that Saturn going over the ascendant is rarely a difficult transit for people. It's kind of self-empowering. You sort of want to renovate your life. You throw overboard the things that don't really work for you anymore. Sometimes a little bit coldly. That's one of the problems. That's one of the bigger problems of Saturn going over the ascendant. You get rid of stuff and people a little too readily, and a little too coldly. But it's generally thought of as being, okay, I got to get serious. I got to make some decisions here about my life. And in that sense, it's really not all that bad. So, Aries, yeah, you're not going to be able to do everything. You're probably going to toss some stuff overboard, but it's a pretty healthy process if you let it. Well, Saturn's not crazy about being in Aries, may get you to be a little bit too much in one direction, or maybe too hesitant to get rid of things or to toss. Well, you're in Aries, you're not too hesitant to toss things overboard. All right, working backwards. If you have a Pisces ascendant or you're a Pisces, then this is a financial transit for you. And again, the specifics of when Saturn goes into your house of finances are going to vary by individual, but the general feel of it is if you have a Pisces ascendant, this is a time of financial constriction. It isn't bad necessarily, and the economy is not wonderful. The economy is not wonderful right now as Saturn's going into Aries, but it's not bad. It's just an indication that you need to be conservative in your spending. Make sure that the outflows and the inflows are in some kind of balance. Don't let the outflows get too big and the inflows too small. Right? So this is a financial transit if you're Pisces. And generally speaking, what happens when Saturn goes into the house of finances, you get a little shock, just like the credit card bill is just a little too big that month. You're like, wow, I spent a lot, and it's a little bit of a shock and, sort of cobble together a plan to pay off. And then you can kind of relax a bit. It's not usually disastrous. You know, it depends what you've done up until now, but it's not usually too disastrous in and of itself. For Aquarius, this is a third house transit. This might have something to do with your siblings. It might have something to do with your neighborhood, your neighbors. It could have to do with your peers in general, dealing with your peers, dealing with the community. You might not be feeling so much for the community, your local neighborhood type of thing. It might not be that, you're feeling great about your town or your block or whatever it is. It might be a sense of being a little bit of discomfort there. Or more positively, you might really feel that you want to work in your community. Like, let's build it up. Let me contribute to my community. Let me be part of the bigger picture and do something out there. You know, run for mayor or something like that. Well, I don't know if you want to do anything that dramatic. Okay, going back to Capricorn. Now, for Capricorn, this is a fourth house transit, and what we have to say about that is it could have something to do with your home. Get ready to call the plumber. Saturn rules plumbers. But let's say not everybody with Capricorn rising is going to have to call the plumber. It's Very likely, though, that there are home issues to deal with, family issues, most typically in terms of one's parents and that family, as opposed to your family that you have, of where you are the principal, more where you are the child, that family, and the extended family they're from. So that's probably where, but yes, home things could come up for you. The decision to sell a home or buy a home might be particularly challenging for Capricorn, especially Capricorn rising at this time. There could be a little bit of a thing for you guys. Okay, going back to Sagittarius, then this is a fifth house transit. It might have something to do with children, but it could also have something to do with your creativity. It could have something to do with what you do that brings you joy in your life. And again, it's not like you can't feel the joy. It's not like you're not going to enjoy the thing that you do that you love to do. You may very well continue to enjoy it, but you probably have to focus on it or let it go. Do I want to continue to be part of the community theater program? Do I want to continue to do such and such? That kind of thing. Do I really need seasons tickets to the Mets? Do I really need seasons tickets to the Met? That kind of thing is going to come up for you. And if you're in, Saturn doesn't care. Saturn wants you to decide. If you're in, you're in. For Scorpio, it's a sixth house transit. Now, sixth house is one of the houses that's a little bit, um, just because it doesn't really connect. That's the thing. That's the thing. Aries and Scorpio don't really connect. Scorpio is Mars home sign, but it's Mars on the defensive, and Aries is Mars on the offensive, right? So they're different kind of approaches. They're sort of the same temperament, but with different approaches. So a sixth house transit could have a lot to do with, let's say, dealing with coworkers. It could have a lot to do with, and that's, in terms of issues that may come up, I would say that would be typical for Scorpio ascendant. Also, though, where you're going to be of service, where you're going to contribute. That's what Saturn in Aries is great for, getting us to think about that. So it's a sixth house transit. It is likely to have to do with that sense of service. One thing about Saturn in Aries for Scorpio ascendants, insofar as this is a sixth house transit, is that it is certainly no ego inflator, right? This is a kind of, you need to contribute, you need to be of service, you need to do things, help out. This is the feeling there. If you are a Libra, if you're a Libra, then this is a seventh house transit, and the focus would therefore be on relationships. Now, the seventh house is all kinds of relationships, certainly personal relationships, your significant other, but also sometimes opponents, and others. And again, Saturn is saying, let's take things the way we want to take them. Let's make a decision over here. Are we going to commit further? Are we going to separate, walk away? Now, it's not the case that every Libra is going to have this big decision in their personal relationship. In dealing with others, you'll have this decision to make many times as we go through the next few years. You have to sort of decide where things are going to go for you. Because you're a Libra, and if you're a Libra sun, this is particularly useful. If you're a Libra sun, then Saturn is opposite the sun at some point in time. And although Saturn is in his least favorite sign, he's in the sun's favorite sign, and vice versa. The sun is in his least favorite sign, but Saturn's favorite sign. And so we have what we call a mutual reception. And that means that Libra, you should be able to work things out. There may be some tensions, there may be some opposition, there may be some polarity, but it shouldn't be something that is, completely above and beyond anything that you can deal with, and you could probably come to a good solution. Anyway, let's hope so. For Virgo, this is an eighth house transit. Now, this is another one of those kind of wonky transits there. As an eighth house transit, the concern might be for going back and sort of doing a little bit of personal psychoanalysis. We're actually getting some psychoanalysis. It's kind of like digging back into your past, or alternatively, a sort of shamanic journey to work on your issues, as it were. It would probably be a challenging indicator if Virgo, especially Virgo ascendant, if you're looking at securing loans and things like that. Again, it's not an impossibility, but you may not be very happy with the terms. You may not, it may be a struggle to get approved and things like that. So if you're a Virgo ascendant, particularly, and again, it depends when Saturn goes into your eighth house, you may have some issues with finances. It's also a real, with those types of finance, securing loans and so on. It's also not that you would cheat on your taxes, Virgo, but it's a very, very poor time to bend the truth when it comes to taxes, when it comes to dealing with insurance companies and things like that, right? So when you're dealing with any of those monsters, you want to make sure that you have that you're on the up and up. All right, now going back, we have Leo. From Leo, it's a ninth house transit, and that sort of puts a little bit of a pressure on things like travel and higher education and that big picture stuff. Now, if Saturn is going through your ninth house, very likely travel should have a little bit of a purpose. It's often the case that, 5 days down in the Caribbean or wherever, just sitting on a beach, doesn't really feel that great when Saturn is going through your ninth house. But if you could make a pilgrimage, let's say, to if we make a pilgrimage to wherever you like, if you have that sense that you're doing something for learning or if you're doing something for work, then it should go pretty well. But yeah, it puts a little bit of the on it. Uh, if you're just looking to have fun. It's also a time when you may question religious beliefs and philosophical systems. There may be a kind of, what am I doing with this particular, is this real? Is this teacher, is this guru real? On the other hand, it could also push you to want to find a genuine teacher, So things that are good, things that are working, they're going to work. Things that are not so great, you're likely to toss overboard. That's the theme. If you've been watching this whole thing, you'll know that this is the theme of Saturn wherever he goes, and this is how it's playing out. So yeah, so this could be a bit of a test for you in terms of your worldview, in terms of the big picture stuff. Cancer, this is a 10th house transit for you, and thus it is likely to affect career reputation. Right? And again, it's not a bad thing. You're likely to get rewards for work you have done, particularly over the past 10 years. The reward will probably come in the form of more work to do, more responsibility, and sometime maybe when Saturn gets into Taurus, it may even bring you a little financial reward. It may bring you financial reward earlier, especially with Jupiter coming into your sign in 2025, 26. It may bring you a little bit of financial reward immediately, but almost certainly a little bit more work. Also, decisions. Am I going to stay with this career path or am I going to make a change? Not so much about work in the day-to-day sense. It's more like, is this career path working for me? It may be for some folks, it may be time to start thinking about retirement. It might be a time when the industry that you're in begins to change substantially and contract. And that's, of course, that may not be personal to you, Cancer, right? This isn't about you. The entire industry is contracting. It's like you owned a Blockbuster. I love this Blockbuster thing. You hear it all the time from me. But you owned a Blockbuster video store in the 90s. It was great. And then, sometime around 2008 or so, There's no more need for videotapes and DVDs. We're going to do everything by streaming services. Remember when Netflix used to send you a DVD and you'd send it back to them? That was their original idea. Anyways, so it could be like that. It may not be about you personally. All right, that's for Cancer. That's a 10th house transit. You gotta make decisions. You gotta make decisions. Going now to Gemini, this is an 11th house transit. Friendships. Now you're thinking, oh boy, I got skunked. Everybody else, they got career stuff going on, financial stuff. Here I am, it's going to be about friendships. We take friendships for granted. Geminis probably don't take friendships for granted. You like to have friends, you like to have people that you connect with. When Saturn goes through your 11th house, very, very frequently you lose some friends. And the reason why you lose them, though, is not because, that you have this terrible, stupid fight that shouldn't have been. It's because they don't really fit with your long-term view of things. They don't fit with your big picture. They don't really serve where you're going. The people that were just, maybe you work with them or you used to work with them or you grew up with them, all of these things that seem to be, the people that are just there and they're great sometimes, but they're not really on the same page with you anymore. That things have changed and now you sort of want to move on from them or, they may want to move on from you. So the upshot, though, is it could be a somewhat painful process, especially as you're like, geez, I don't know, I just don't want to do that. And why don't I want to do that? Why do I find this person suddenly annoying? That's the negative side of it. But the positive side of it is that at some point, it may take a little while. At some point, you'll find that you bring in new friends who are on the same page with you, who have more of a heart-centered connection and a little bit less of the, well, yeah, we just happen to live in the same town and that's why we're friends type of thing. So it's maybe a difficult process at the beginning, but at the end, maybe not so much. And then finally, Taurus. Taurus, this is a 12th house transit for you, and 12th house transits are a little bit difficult. I want to say that the secret to the 12th house transit is that you feel that you are somehow or another behind the scenes in your own life. Somehow or another, you feel that no matter how much you have going on, and Taurus, this does not take away in any way, shape, size, or form from what is going on. What is going on, somehow or another, you still feel like you're behind the scenes. You still feel like you're kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Things could be happening all over your life. It could be actually a fairly exciting year. And yet, somehow or another, you're waiting for Saturn to go over the ascendant. So, the most important thing for you to keep in mind, Taurus, is simply that. You're likely to feel like you're waiting. You don't need to wait. You don't need to wait, but you're likely to feel like you're waiting. All right, and one little bonus thing that we have now is if you're having your Saturn return. If you were born in 1996 to 1999, if you were 97 to 99, if you were born in 67 to 69, and you are having your Saturn return, well, if you're at your first Saturn return, Saturn in Aries is very much about becoming your own authority. Very typically, Saturn in Aries, if you're at your first Saturn return, if you're born in the late 90s there, very likely your sense of authority and structure that you got from, who knows, your parents, whatever, not a great model for you. For you, it somehow didn't work. And the two responses to that are I'm just going to do whatever I want to do, or I'm not going to do anything. But as you get to your Saturn return, you start to think to yourself, okay, maybe I'll take the reins. Maybe I'll be the one making the decision. Maybe I will be the person who is going to decide. And I'll be my own authority. I'll drive myself. I'll do my own parenting. I'll be my own boss. But if you're going to be your own boss, then you're going to be really, really, a good one. You're going to keep yourself in line. So it may have been a long slog to get here, but now that you're here at your first Saturn return, Saturn and Aries people, this is really an opportunity for you. If you are at your second Saturn return, if you were born in the late 60s and you're at your second Saturn return, well, now we've got a whole other thing going on. You had that experience that who's the authority in my life? Is it me? You had that back in the 90s. And now you're reflecting on how you did. You had the fairly difficult transition into adulthood. That adulthood now we could say starts at 30. But you had a fairly difficult transition into that period of time. And since the late 90s, how did you do? How well did you do as your own authority? And so that's the challenge. That's the specific challenge of the second Saturn return for you. How have I done at being my own authority? All right, there you have it. Saturn and Aries. All right, see you. I'll see you every week for the forecast. I'll see you next maybe for Jupiter in Cancer and then Uranus in Gemini. But for now, just watch the weekly forecast and see you soon.